I mean, I think one thing maybe to reiterate, which was what I was saying right before we took the break, is now that we're starting to do more assembly, now that we're starting to actually put together more complex scripts, a good way to approach it is exactly what I said before the break, and it works really well with Scratch because Scratch tries to use plain language. So if you're working on something in Scratch, one suggestion would be to start down with piece of paper and pencil or word processor if you want to do it that way, and just sort of write out in simple instructional terms what it is you're trying to have happen. Because then if you can take that language and just convert it into the blocks that are available in Scratch, that can be a really good way to get a program going, is to just start from that sort of conversational perspective and then work your way into the language from there. All right. Well, then the other half of the evening is about variables and lists, and actually this is going to be a lot more straightforward than the first part of operators and reporters. There's kind of only two things to talk about, and there's sort of a very limited number of things to talk about in each case. And they're actually related to each other to begin with. So we're really only talking about one thing, but in a couple of ways. So when you scroll down to the bottom of the code list on Scratch, the last category, or next to the last category, is variables. And they're this sort of orangey color. And as the name implies, a variable is computer speak for a container for some piece of information that might or does change or is going to need to change. Hence the term variable. If it's fixed, if it's just the number 3, then you can just use the number 3 anywhere you need to use it. But if it's something in a program that is going to change, that you need to keep track of or be able to share among different sprites, then variables are the containers to do that. The nice thing about Scratch's approach to variables is variables in other computing languages can get very complex because they have different kinds of variables for different types of information. So you kind of need to know ahead of time, is this a number? Is it a text? Is it and you have to define the variable that way. And then if you put something else into that variable, it doesn't work. Scratch is pretty smart when it comes to variables in that it figures out how to use the information. So if you put a number into a variable, then you can put that variable into a math equation and it will evaluate it. But you could also put text into a variable, and then you could use the join command and it will join the text that's in the variable. So it knows what you're putting in there and then allows you to use it correctly. So the one thing about variables that is new is that the program, well, it does come with one variable already defined, but basically you have to create the variables. And you don't do that in your script. You have to do it before you bring the variable into the script. So essentially, you are creating blocks in Scratch that then Scratch will use. So we've kind of backed up even another level here. So the first thing you always have to do in the variable area is click on the button that says make a variable. And also, it used to be that computers could only have a very limited number of ways you could name a variable. Scratch is also very forgiving in terms of naming variables. So I always say, give it a name that makes sense. Because a lot of programs, you're going to end up with a lot of variables. And if you lose track of which one's doing what. So let's say that we just want a variable name that we're going to call sprite x position, right? Make it very descriptive. There's always this option of doing it for all sprites or for just this sprite. I would suggest leaving it on for all sprites unless you get into a situation down the road where you really need to limit it. The only reason you would limit it to a specific sprite is if you want to use the same name in multiple sprites. in that case, it can only be used from one sprite to the next, because then otherwise it gets confused about which variable you're using. But for now, the best thing to do is just give every variable a unique name and make it available to all sprites. And then that way, if for some reason this sprite over here wants to know this variable that's created by this sprite over here, they can share that information. So it's a lot more flexible. So gave it a name, said for all sprites, I hit OK. And now you'll see over here in the list, there's now a new reporter that is for the sprite X position. So I now have that I can drag into my scripts and use. Another thing to notice is that every time you create a variable, it makes that variable visible in your workspace. There may be situations where you want your users to see a variable, but most often not. So what I usually do right away is just click the checkbox next to the sprite, next to the variable name, and then it disappears off of the screen. You can always turn it back on if you're troubleshooting. You need to see what value a variable has. You can always display it, but then you can turn it back off just by clicking the checkbox. So I now have a container called sprite X position. Right now, that container, if I drag it out here and click on it, is 0. There's nothing in it. It's an empty container. So the next thing you always need to do with a variable is to assign it. You need to give it a value. You need to set it to something. So this very first command here says set, and then there's a pull-down menu, and then there's an area for a value. So every variable that you create is going to show up in this list, plus the ability to rename variables or to delete variables. So you can do that right from here. But I want to do this sprite X position, so I'm going to take sprite X position. So let's say I want to set sprite X position to 50. So now when I click on that, now that variable, if I click on the variable, is now equal to 50. So I've now filled that container with that information. Now we can combine what we were just doing, and we could say, let's use a reporter, and let's actually get the sprite's real position and put that in there. So now when I run it, the X position is going to be whatever the sprite actually is. So you can set variables to just about anything. You could give it a number, you could pull a piece of information and put it in there, whatever you want to do. So that's the set function. So that's usually the first thing you do once you have a variable is you set it to something. Even if it's going to change in the program, there's usually some value that every variable starts off with. So a lot of times in a script, the very first few commands are just setting variables to whatever those are. Now, so now I've got that sprite X position set, and I can now use that reporter to do any number of things. I'm going to use this script that was here from earlier, and I'm actually going to have it, if the cat is on the right side of the screen, it's actually going to tell us the sprite X position. So I'm going to move this up here. So now when the cat is clicked, it's going to set that variable to that value. And then in this case, if it's on the right side of the screen, it will say it. So if I click on the cat, it says 150. Move it somewhere else, click on it again, 107. So it's now reporting the value of that variable as I move the cat around. All right, so that's setting it. The other thing you can do, really the only other thing you can do to manipulate the variable, is this change command. The change command only works if your variable has a number in it. And this is just a shortcut for changing a variable by a fixed amount. So very oftentimes you'll use counters. You need to know how many times something has happened. So you'll set up a variable, And each time the loop runs, you want that counter to increase by 1. You could do it with a set by saying, set the sprite to the value of the sprite plus 1. But the easier way to do it is with this change command. And what the change command then will do is it'll take whatever that value currently is, and then you tell it how much to change it by. So I'll change it by 5. So right now the sprite X position value is 182. If I click on this, now it should be, oh, now it's run a couple of times. Oh, because it's not reporting. Right. Oops, I was clicking on the wrong thing. Who knows what it is now. So now it's up to 207 because I clicked on it a bunch of times. It kept increasing it by 5 every time I clicked on it. But that won't work if the variable has a word in it, it can't change a word by an amount. So in that case, the program will get confused and say, yeah, I don't know what to do with this. So that's really, honestly, that's it in terms of what you can do with variables. They do give you 2 commands that allow you to show and hide variables on the screen. So if for some reason in the middle of your program you did want a variable's value to show up, you can put that in your script. The only thing that's a little weird about it and why I think it's not that useful is you really can't do anything with formatting this. It will just give you the name of the variable and the value of it. You can put it somewhere on the screen and it will remember where you put it, but that's kind of all you can do. So it's kind of limited. I use it more for troubleshooting if I just need to be able to see what is a value of a variable. But they do give you those options to show and hide variables in there as well. But honestly, beyond that, you create a variable, you set it to an amount, and then in the course of a script, you either change it by a certain amount or you set it to a different value. And then anywhere that you want to use that value, you pull out the variables reporter and just plug that in to anywhere that's got any of those round spaces.
Could you use that to count points, let's say? Like number of points gained or something like that?
Absolutely. So, that actually is a really common use of it in a game type of situation is, even if the program doesn't know how to give points, you could even set up just a counter for a game where when the students are playing it, they know if they score a point, they click on an icon on the screen, and that would then increase, you would then script it so when they click on it, it increases their score by 1 or by 5 or whatever you want to set up. And you could then also set it up so that it then displays that value on the screen in some way, whether that's a costume that is the number and it moves to that costume, or it does it by having a sprite say the number or whatever. I will say, since you brought that up, the one big deficiency that I've run into in Scratch, and a lot of people are talking about it, there is no easy way to just print a text on the screen. The only way to really do it is with the say function where it puts it in that little thought bubble. But if you literally just want to have text show up on the screen, unless you create a sprite that has that text as a costume, that's one way to do it. But if the text needs to change or be responsive, there's not an easy way to do that. And I wish there was. Back in the early programming languages, there was always a command called print. And print didn't mean print to your printer. It meant print to the screen. So if you just said print, quote, hello, end quote, and ran it, it would just put the word hello on the screen. Scratch doesn't really have the equivalent of that. And that's one thing I wish it did, because there are times where I wish I could just have it put a text on the screen like, your score is, and then have it change the number. But there are workarounds, but they're not a lot of fun. All right, so my variable, hide that. So that's kind of it for variables. Name it, set it, and then use that variable if there's something that changes. The kind of grown-up version of a variable is a list. And right now there are no list commands because until there is a list in your script, it doesn't bother giving you the commands you can use on a list. Because it creates one variable right from the beginning, it gives you the variable commands. So just like with the variable, the first thing you have to do is tell it to make a list. Think of a list as like a two-dimensional variable. So it'll have a number of items, and each of those items can be a number or a text or some piece of information. So if you want to store a bunch of things, then a list is usually a better way to do it rather than setting up a whole bunch of individual variables. So if I click on make a list, exactly the same as with variables, I would suggest giving it a name that is descriptive. I would suggest making the list available to all sprites. Click OK. And now, just like with variables, there is now a reporter here called colors. And all of these additional blocks have shown up that relate to lists. I don't know that I need to go through each of these individually because they're all kind of copies of things we've done other places. But just in terms of the list itself, the first thing you'll notice is just like with variables, the list shows up on the screen. So you can actually, right from here, type items into the list. So if you want to have a series of things already in a list when the person starts your program, then you can just do this. You click on the plus, and let's say yellow, whoops, only one O. Add another one, let's say red. Who's got a favorite color that's not yellow or red?
Purple.
Purple. I just like this name, fuchsia. All right, so anyway, so you can add items into this list. You can delete items whenever you're on a particular item. You can edit it. You can also delete it. So that's sort of the most basic way to create the list. But then the real thing is, well, what do I do with that information now? So that's where you get into the blocks. So for example, add thing to, and you can tell it what list if you've got multiple lists. So I could say add, what don't we have? Blue. So I could do this through a command and say add blue to colors. And when I click on it, it now has added a new item to the list that is blue. So I can do that. I can delete an item, and it allows me to choose which item. So maybe I'm not so happy with fuchsia. So I could say delete item 4 of colors. Boom. Fuchsia's gone. It moved blue up. So now I'm back to a list of 4. You can delete all. And this usually gets done at the beginning of a program. If you want to have the user input the items, you want to wipe out anything that might be in there, you can delete everything with this command. You can insert things at a particular location. So maybe I want to put that fuchsia back in position 4. So I can specify that, and then it'll insert it back into the list. So there's a lot of things you can do to the list to either build it or to edit it or replace items. That's the other thing, you can replace items. And then in terms of pulling the information off of it, we have a whole series of reporters. The main 3 are these 3, which will either give you the item, whatever item you specify. So if I said item 3 of colors and clicked on it, it would give me purple. I can have it tell me where an item is in a list. So I want to know where red is in the list. I click on it and it tells me that red is number 2. So there might be a need to do that. And it can also tell you the length. So if a user has entered a bunch of things and you want to know how many they entered, you can have it tell you, well, they put 7 things into the list or whatever. So you can return that. So basically it's like variables, but on steroids. It's giving you a whole collection of pieces of information where then you can access individual parts of those pieces and so on. Now to finish up with what came up earlier about asking, because this is a really common thing to do, is back up here in sensing, there is this ask command. Let me get myself down to a blank space here. There is an ask command, and you can type in whatever you want to type in here in terms of the question. So I could say, what is your favorite color? And it'll then say ask and wait. So it will pause the script until I give it an answer. So if I run it on the screen, this text entry pops up, and my sprite now is asking, what's your favorite color? And I could put in orange and then hit OK. Great, but it didn't do anything with it. All it did was ask the question. So then the next thing is dealing with the answer, and the answer shows up in its very own reporter. So this is like a variable, but it's a variable that will contain whatever the last answered question was. So it doesn't hold on to it for very long, but for the time being, once somebody answers a question, that container holds their answer. So what I would probably want to do, because I want to hold on to this, is I'm going to set up a variable, and I'm just going to call that answer color. So once it's asked me, I'm going to tell it to set answer color to the answer. So whatever I type in, when I hit enter, now my variable answer color will now be the same as answer. So now I can do things with that. Just to combine everything together, why don't I take that thing and add it? So I'm going to add, instead of adding thing, I'm going to add my answer color to my list of colors. So now my list here will expand as people type in their answers. So what's your favorite color? Let's go with, oh, I did orange before, but it didn't. So I type in orange. Now it added that to the list because it asked it. It then set this variable to the answer, and then it put that answer variable into my list. Make sense? Now, some of you may be realizing I could have done this an easier way. I could have just done away with the variable altogether and just said, well, I could just add the answer directly to colors and it would do the same thing. But this way, it's not sitting in a variable. It would only put it in the list. But depending on what you're trying to do, there's always more than one way to usually do any given thing. So variables and by extension lists in combination with math and with other reporters, because you could have somebody say, what X should I go to? And then have it go to set X to answer. So, and let's put an event on there so we don't have to keep clicking on it here. So let's say when we click on the sprite, oh, I've got another one up here. Let me break this one. Doop. So it's not doing that one too. So now when I click on the sprite, it's going to ask me what X should I go to. Let's start by going to 0. I hit enter, and the sprite now moves to 0 because it took the answer and it used that as information to set X. Click on it again. I want to go to -120. Boom. Cat moves back to -120. So this is where it all starts coming together. And this is, again, where that kind of narrative approach, I think, can be helpful, especially as is the case for many of you, you have not written a whole lot of computer code in your lives. So before you start trying to click blocks together, jot down just in plain English, what is it that you're trying to do? What are the set of instructions? What needs to happen? And then look at what you wrote, and you should now be able to start to pull out the important words like if, or go to, or change, or ask, and start to turn those into blocks so that you can start assembling blocks together. Okay. So I do want to I know last time I kind of finished the class up and let go, but I want to make sure I get one more check-in with everybody having had a chance to kind of look at variables and lists. So, but I'll make it a little shorter. Let's say 15 minutes. So back at about 6:20, and then it should only take me about 10 minutes or so to wrap up the evening and talk about work for next week and so on. So, maybe if you've already created something using the math and the reporters, maybe now try to incorporate a variable into what you were doing, or like I was doing here, have it ask a question and then use the answer of that question to do something or to say something. So try to incorporate at least a variable. If you don't get to lists, then that's probably fine, but at least figure out how to define a variable and then how to use it in some context in some way. All right, good.